Jerusalem. A city where history, faith, and legend intertwine so tightly that even truth itself becomes a kind of myth. For thousands of years, the Temple Mount has stood as the most sacred piece of ground in the world, the beating heart of three religions, the line between heaven and earth. No archaeologist has ever dug beneath it. No instrument has ever been allowed to peer through its stone foundation. It was forbidden, untouchable. But as history has always shown, what is forbidden most often becomes what humanity cannot resist. In early 2024, a small team of data scientists in Tel Aviv began an experimental project using artificial intelligence to reconstruct ancient Jerusalem. It was a harmless academic venture, or so they thought. They had no excavation permits, but they did have access to one of the most advanced ground-penetrating radar arrays ever built, capable of sending harmless electromagnetic waves deep into solid bedrock. What began as a digital experiment turned into something else the moment those waves passed under the Temple Mount. The images that returned were not supposed to exist. Beneath the bedrock, patterns began to emerge, too symmetrical, too deliberate to be natural. Straight lines, right angles, a geometry too perfect for random geology, and at the very center of the grid, an empty space, sealed off, dense, and perfectly cubic, as if the rock itself had been molded to hide it. The AI labeled it automatically, sealed void, a void, man-made, untouched for nearly 3,000 years. When the team reconstructed the three-dimensional image, the outline of a cylindrical object appeared, metallic, dense, leaden. Encased within it, something thin and rolled, like a scroll. They enhanced the scan. Strange engravings circled the outer casing, not Hebrew, not Aramaic, but something older, carved into the lead like a ring of symbols protecting whatever was inside. One of the researchers, an expert in Semitic linguistics, leaned closer. "These characters, they're older than Hebrew," she whispered. The AI analyzed the patterns, reconstructing the fragmented symbols line by line. When the results appeared, no one spoke. The translation was simple. Only 3 words. Do, not open. 3 words that cut through the room like thunder. No one laughed. No one tried to rationalize it, because everyone there knew what that location meant. The Temple Mount is the most politically and spiritually explosive ground on earth. A single rumor about digging beneath it has sparked riots, wars, deaths. If this discovery, this sealed chamber, were real, revealing it could ignite a fire across nations. A young engineer tried to speak. "It might just be interference," he said softly, as if the words themselves could calm the unease in the room. But no one answered, because even as he said it, the radar feed began to flicker. The reflection from the sealed space shifted, no longer dull stone but metallic resonance, as if the chamber was absorbing part of the signal. Since the days of Solomon, temples have risen and fallen on that mount. Empires came and went, faiths divided and reformed. But no record, not in scripture, not in archaeology, has ever mentioned a hidden chamber sealed within the rock itself. And yet, there it was. The team secured the data and encrypted the results. By morning, their project was shut down. A government directive cited national security and religious sensitivity. All copies of the data were confiscated. Each team member signed a non-disclosure agreement. But in the digital age, secrets travel fast. A few still images, the cross-section of the sealed chamber, the lead capsule, and those 3 words had already begun to circulate online. Soon, scholars around the world debated whether it was a hoax or a revelation. Some said the radar reading was an illusion, compression artifacts in the data. Others pointed to ancient accounts hinting that the mount once concealed something forbidden to be seen. Among the fragments of Babylonian records, one line stood out, written millennia ago. "He who breaks the seal of Zion shall see what was never meant for mortal eyes." That night, Jerusalem slept under quiet skies. But somewhere, in encrypted chat rooms, in whispered conversations between academics, and in the hearts of those who had seen the scan, a question began to grow, dark and persistent. If there truly is a seal beneath the Temple Mount, who placed it there? And what were they trying to keep from being released? To understand why no one dares to dig beneath the Temple Mount, you have to understand what that ground means. For the Jewish people, it is the site of Solomon's temple, the dwelling place of the divine presence, where heaven and earth once met within the Holy of Holies. For Muslims, it is Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary, where the Prophet Muhammad is believed to have ascended to heaven during the night journey. And for Christians, it is the sacred plateau where Jesus walked, taught, and prayed. 3 faiths, 1 mountain, each layer of belief pressed atop the other like sediment, ancient, heavy, and volatile. To disturb that soil is to disturb history itself. Even the most devout archaeologists have always known where to stop. There are invisible lines in Jerusalem, not marked by fences, but by fear and faith. Because if you cross them, you don't just risk angering a community, you risk setting the world on fire. It has happened before. In 1996, when Israeli authorities opened a tunnel near the mount to extend a tourist route, it was meant to be a small act, a simple archaeological project. Within hours, riots erupted across Jerusalem and the West Bank. 70 people were killed. The violence was not over politics or land. It was over the ground itself. That memory lingers in every scholar who studies the Mount. Which is why the phrase, unauthorized survey beneath Temple Mount, was enough to make governments panic. The Israeli Antiquities Authority, the Waqf, the Vatican, everyone suddenly had something to lose. Because what if the chamber was real? If a secret structure truly lay beneath that plateau, it could challenge 3 millennia of sacred narratives. No one knew what story the stone might tell, only that it could divide humanity overnight. The Temple Mount, for all its silence, has always been a battlefield. Its surface gleams with the gold of the Dome of the Rock, a monument built over what some call the foundation stone, the point where creation itself began, and where, legend says, Abraham prepared to sacrifice his son. Beneath it lies centuries of conquest and collapse. Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Ottomans, each adding their own layer of devotion and destruction. No one owns this mountain. No one truly understands it. Every religion claims it. Every empire fears it. And that is why Charles Warren's lantern still flickers in the footnotes of history. In the 19th century, Warren, a British officer and explorer, attempted to trace the hidden foundations of Solomon's temple. With ropes and torches, he descended into the narrow aqueducts beneath Jerusalem. He mapped underground channels, shafts, and water tunnels surrounding the mount, a maze older than the city itself. But he was stopped before reaching the sacred rock. The Ottoman authorities forbade him to dig further. His expedition ended at the threshold of mystery. For over a century, that invisible boundary remained intact. Scholars could only imagine what lay beneath, until the rise of machines that could see without touching. In the 21st century, curiosity found a new form: algorithms. Instead of shovels, researchers now used scanners, AI, and geological modeling to ask questions that were once heresy. Ground-penetrating radar doesn't break stone. It passes through it. It does not dig. It sees. But even sight can be an act of violation. When the 2024 AI survey revealed the sealed void, it wasn't the stone that trembled. It was belief. The idea that something forbidden existed under the holiest ground on earth tore through theological circles like lightning. Some called it blasphemy. Others called it prophecy fulfilled. Jerusalem became electric with whispers. Was the discovery real? Was it a trick of technology? Or had someone, 3,000 years ago, sealed something beneath the mount, not to protect it from us, but to protect us from it? Officials moved quickly to smother the story. The images disappeared. Servers were wiped. But in an age where data never truly dies, the fragments lingered, copied, shared, decrypted, and re-uploaded by anonymous hands. Those who saw them described a peculiar detail. a pattern of perfect geometry. Lines too straight, angles too exact. The symmetry of intelligence, not of chance. An archaeologist from Oxford remarked quietly in an interview that never aired, "If this structure exists, it predates Herod. It might even predate Solomon. And if that's true, then who built it?" Who indeed? The Temple Mount, as the scriptures tell, was chosen by divine command. But the mountain itself, Mount Moriah, existed long before religion gave it a name. In Canaanite lore, it was a place where gods descended. In Phoenician myth, it was the mountain that touched the sky. Perhaps the builders of that sealed chamber were not followers of Yahweh or Allah or Christ, but something far older. And perhaps that is why, after all this time, no one has dared to break the rock. Because faith might be shaken, but fear endures. As night falls over Jerusalem, the dome glows under floodlights, gold reflecting stars. Pilgrims walk above stone corridors that may hide the oldest secret of all, that what stands at the center of the world was never meant to be touched. The images began as faint shadows, distortions on a screen that looked more like static than revelation. Yet as the AI processed each wave of radar data, those blurs took on edges, then shapes, then a language all their own. A web of perfect geometry began to bloom beneath the Temple Mount, rectangular voids, symmetrical corridors, and sharp right angles drawn in the darkness of bedrock. What first appeared as random noise now looked like intention. Someone, thousands of years ago, had designed this place. The scientists ran comparison overlays using the original maps drawn by British surveyors in the late 1800s, back when Charles Warren's team had lowered their torches into the ancient tunnels. When the new radar maps aligned with those century-old sketches, something uncanny emerged. The AI found consistent structural continuities, lines that extended far beyond the tunnels Warren recorded. In plain words, there was more beneath the mount than anyone had ever seen. At first, they believed it might be another layer of Jerusalem's vast underground water system. The city is riddled with aqueducts and cisterns from every age, the bones of civilizations stacked in stone. But the radar readings contradicted that theory. These spaces weren't random hollows carved by erosion or channeled by water. Their walls reflected like cut surfaces. They formed a deliberate pattern. The more the team refined their scans, the more it looked like architecture. 8 main chambers arranged in near-perfect symmetry, all aligned along the Mount-S eastern axis, the same orientation as the ancient temple described in the Hebrew Bible. And deeper still, below those rooms, the radar detected voids completely sealed off from every known tunnel. There were no passages in or out, just blocks of silence where nothing, no roots, no water, no trace of life, could reach. When the AI rendered a composite 3D model of the subterranean complex, the researchers stared at the screen in disbelief. Each chamber was mathematically precise. The ratios matched ancient Mesopotamian design principles. Base 6 measurements, harmonic spacing, and angular division found only in high ceremonial structures. "Impossible," one geologist murmured. This level of precision didn't exist in Jerusalem 3,000 years ago. The lead archaeologist disagreed quietly. Unless it wasn't built in Jerusalem. That comment lingered like smoke. If these chambers were older than the first temple, then they had been there before Solomon's masons ever laid their chisels on Mount Moriah. Which begged the question, was the temple built on top of something that already existed? By now the team had grown uneasy. The scans were too clear, the geometry too deliberate. A religious historian in the group warned that they were trespassing on sacred ground, digitally, if not physically. But curiosity has its own kind of faith. When they enhanced the next layer of data, the system highlighted materials with unusually high density, metals embedded within the stone. Lead, mercury, traces of gold. It made no sense. There should have been nothing metallic in the bedrock. The AI flagged those signatures as anomalous inclusions. Then, without prompting, it generated a visual projection of what the site might look like if excavated. What appeared on the screen made everyone fall silent. An underground structure shaped like a shrine, pillars carved into the rock, altars or tables made of polished limestone, and at the center, a circular platform surrounded by symbols cut into the floor in a perfect ring. The archaeologist froze. That can't be right. We're looking at a fully preserved sanctuary. He was correct. The scans showed no signs of collapse or damage. The walls were clean, unfractured. Even the supposed furnishings, objects resting on the altars, seemed intact. The data suggested that the complex had remained sealed, untouched by earthquakes, floods, or war since the 8th century BCE. It was as though time itself had chosen to ignore this place. The deeper they looked, the more the evidence contradicted known history. According to scripture, King Hezekiah had destroyed every rival shrine in Judah during his religious reforms, centralizing worship to the Jerusalem temple. The Bible says he removed the high places, broke the sacred pillars, and cut down the Asherah poles. Every other place of worship had been erased, and yet this one remained, not broken, not looted, sealed. The implications were staggering. Either the chamber predated Hezekiah's purge, or someone within the priesthood had defied the king and preserved their shrine in secret. The altars, the basins, even traces of organic residue, animal fat, olive oil, incense, suggested an active cult of worship that had simply vanished overnight. But if they had sealed themselves away, what were they hiding from? The AI's analysis continued automatically, identifying patterns in the residue. It found molecular traces of burned resin, similar to frankincense and myrrh, but mixed with something unidentifiable, an ancient compound not found in any known ritual site of Judah or Israel. The data scientist in charge of spectral imaging stared at the graphs for a long time before muttering, "This doesn't belong here." And somewhere in the middle of that night, a thought began to creep into the team's collective mind. If this was a shrine, who or what was it built to honor? The question hung there, suspended between belief and fear. For the first time, the team hesitated to push the scan deeper. They had reached the threshold between archaeology and something older than history. And behind that threshold, the mountain waited. When they resumed the scans, the AI did something none of them expected. It began mapping movement, not motion in real time, but the potential for resonance. Vibrational echoes that suggested the stone itself had been carved to direct sound. Each room in the chamber complex was tuned like an instrument, frequencies bending and merging as if designed for ritual acoustics. The realization hit them slowly. Whoever built this underground structure hadn't just been cutting rock. They had been composing silence. The data's fidelity revealed more than geometry. In the largest of the 8 rooms, radar detected raised platforms that mirrored the layout of ancient high places, or bamat, used for sacrifice. The chemical markers on those platforms, animal fat hardened by time, traces of olive oil and crushed plant matter, matched with known Iron Age sacrificial altars. But something else stood out. Elevated basins built into the walls themselves, as though for washing or for blood. As the spectral analysis deepened, the AI compared the chemical composition with databases from known Judean and Canaanite shrines. The match wasn't local. It aligned instead with patterns found in sites near Byblos and Ugarit, Phoenician cities on the coast of ancient Lebanon. In other words, whoever worshipped here practiced rituals older and wider than those of Israel. The researcher in charge of liturgical comparison sat back, whispering, "This wasn't just another temple. This was a bridge between gods." The phrase unsettled everyone. Because what does it mean to find a bridge beneath the holiest mountain on earth? The more they analyzed, the more contradictions emerged. The architectural style didn't fit any period of documented Jerusalem history. The decorative patterns, though faded, bore the same symmetrical double spiral found in shrines dedicated to both male and female deities, a symbol of divine duality. It was blasphemy buried under sanctity. If the Temple Mount was supposed to represent unity under one god, then this structure represented the opposite: multiplicity, the memory of gods that predated monotheism. Among the debris in the radar maps, one object drew particular attention. It was tall, nearly 3 meters, and perfectly vertical. The AI classified it as a monolith, a single stone column carved from the same bedrock. It stood in the center of the main chamber, unbroken, unmoved, perfectly upright. The archaeologists recognized it immediately. A masabah, a sacred standing stone used in ancient Israelite and Canaanite worship as a representation of divine presence. Scripture records that King Hezekiah ordered such stones destroyed. Yet here, under the mount, one still stood. And then came the spectral anomaly. The stone's outer surface showed traces of a heavy metallic compound. When the data was cross-referenced with spectral libraries, the composition matched one element precisely: mercury. That finding sent a cold ripple through the room. In ancient Mesopotamian and Canaanite ritual, mercury was not ornamental. It was functional. It was used in rites of containment, to bind or imprison spiritual entities, to weigh down symbols of power so they could not rise again. Its reflective surface was thought to mirror the soul of the being within, trapping it in endless reflection. The more they stared at the data, the more the theory began to take shape. What if the underground complex wasn't a sanctuary at all? What if it was a seal? The evidence aligned disturbingly well. The sealed chambers, the precise geometry, the traces of mercury and lead, both materials used historically in ritual bindings. Even the acoustic tuning of the rooms could make sense, a design meant to suppress vibration, to keep energy contained. It was a possibility none of them wanted to voice out loud. One of the linguists, trying to break the tension, opened the Hebrew Bible that lay on the desk beside her laptop. She turned to a passage in Isaiah describing the fallen ones, cast down and bound in the earth by divine decree. Then another in Genesis 6:4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, mighty ones of old. She looked up, half smiling, half terrified. What if they were never just metaphors? No one laughed. Another researcher murmured the words of the Book of Enoch, a text banned from most canons, yet whispering in the background of every Abrahamic faith. And they were bound beneath the mountains of the earth until the day of judgment. Bound beneath the mountains. The room grew still. They all looked at the same image, a perfectly upright standing stone, coated in mercury, sealed beneath the holiest mountain on earth. The archaeologist who had led the project finally spoke, his voice low. We should stop here. This isn't archaeology anymore. But the AI had already gone further. It continued rendering the layers beneath the stone, the hidden strata below the main shrine. And in those final frames, it revealed something that no one could explain. Another cavity, circular, flawless, aligned with the cardinal directions. A chamber beneath the chamber, and carved along its inner rim, faint inscriptions in Paleo-Hebrew began to appear on the screen, sharpened by the AI's reconstruction. Words older than any prayer. Here the warden stands guard, do not open. The silence that followed was heavier than any stone. Someone whispered, maybe it's a warning. The project leader shook his head slowly. Or maybe it's a reminder. The next morning, the team returned to the lab in uneasy quiet. The image of that standing stone lingered in every mind, a monument of defiance, older than the city built above it. For centuries, Scripture had declared that such stones were destroyed, erased by decree, purged by the zeal of reform. And yet, here it was, unbroken, unbowed, perfectly preserved beneath the holiest ground on earth. The lead archaeologist studied the spectral data again, unwilling to trust what he saw. The mercury trace wasn't surface contamination. It coated the entire exterior in an impossibly thin film, as though the stone had once been brushed with liquid metal that hardened into its pores. No ancient tool should have been capable of that. Even modern forensics struggled to explain how such even dispersion could occur in limestone. When they ran a particle density scan, the anomaly deepened. The core of the monolith showed a density inconsistent with its material, almost as if the stone were hollow. But how could a hollow monolith remain upright through 3,000 years of earthquakes and wars? The AI rendered an internal cross-section, showing a faint void just a few centimeters wide running down the center. It might have been a flaw in the rock, or it might not have been. The data couldn't tell. The historian on the team spoke softly, reading from the ancient texts arrayed on his desk. In the days of Hezekiah, the king broke the pillars and shattered the high places that no man may bow before the idols of stone. He looked up. Except this one. The scientist beside him whispered, "Then perhaps it wasn't an idol." They began to search for parallels, other standing stones that had survived destruction. They found two, the twin altars at Tel Arad, discovered decades earlier in the Negev desert. Those two had been sealed rather than destroyed. Archaeologists had always debated why. Was it reverence, rebellion, or fear? Fear. The word returned again and again in the notes. When they compared the shrine under the Temple Mount with the one at Tel Arad, patterns emerged. The same dual altars, the same symmetry, the same traces of oil and fat, even the same ratio between chamber width and ceiling height. Yet the mount structure had one element Arad lacked, the mercury-coated standing stone. The connection was undeniable, and yet the meaning remained out of reach. That night, the linguist returned to the inscriptions on the stone's surface. They weren't complete words, more like fragments of archaic Paleo-Hebrew fused with Proto-Canaanite sigils. When arranged together, they formed a repeating sequence that the AI translated as binding or sealed in oath, but sealed to contain what? The idea grew darker the longer they discussed it. In ancient Mesopotamia, living stones were said to imprison divine essences, not metaphorically, but literally. The priests of Byblos and Carthage had spoken of rituals that used mercury, and led to anchor what they called the fire that fell from the sky. To release it was to unmake the covenant between gods and men. The parallels were too close. A standing stone, coated in mercury, buried beneath a temple, the very definition of a containment seal. And suddenly, Hezekiah's reform no longer looked like simple monotheistic cleansing. It looked like a cover-up. What if those ancient priests hadn't destroyed the rival cults, but buried them, entombing not faith, but something their faith had imprisoned? That possibility turned belief into dread. The team divided in silence. Some wanted to stop, to erase the data before it spread. Others insisted they had already gone too far to turn back. But none of them could deny the pattern emerging on the screen. A shrine beneath the mount, older than the temple. A standing stone coated in mercury. And now, the AI showed faint resonant frequencies emanating from the structure. Vibrations far below seismic range, pulsing in regular intervals. The physicist frowned. "It's not geological," he said. "It's periodic." The amplitude repeated every 42 minutes, too perfect to be random. Something beneath the mount was humming. They ran the readings again and again, thinking it must be interference from the city's machinery or the tram lines that ran nearby, but the pattern didn't match any human source. It was deep, low, almost imperceptible, a pulse older than electricity. The geologist spoke at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's coming from the core of the chamber, from the base of the stone itself." And in that instant, no one in the room felt like a scientist anymore. They felt like intruders. A few dared to speak of legends, the watchers bound beneath the mountains, the spirits cast down by divine order. They remembered the phrase that glimmered faintly on the walls of the lower chamber, "Here the warden stands guard. Do not open." If the warden stood watch, then perhaps this pulse, this vibration, was not a warning at all. Perhaps it was a heartbeat. The lead archaeologist shut down the monitor and exhaled slowly. "We stop here," he said. "No deeper scans, no more layers. If someone sealed it, let it stay sealed." But the AI had already started its next process. Before anyone could abort the sequence, the software began mapping the strata directly beneath the stone. The screen flickered, images resolving grain by grain. Another chamber, perfectly circular, smooth walls, and within it, a central object of higher density, encased in stone and lead. The reading labeled it automatically, unknown artifact. They had seen shrines sealed by sand and time, tombs swallowed by collapsing ceilings, catacombs choked with dust. This was none of those. The radar return of the lower cavity was unnervingly clean, a perfect circle carved into bedrock, 10 feet across by 10 feet high, its inner skin reading as smooth as burnished stone. No fissures, no fractures, no rubble. Not even the ghost of a passageway leading in or out. It was not a room that had survived collapse. It was a room that had been designed to survive everything. The AI overlaid cardinal axes. The chamber's alignment snapped into place along true north and east, within a fraction of a degree, as if whoever cut it had watched the sky long enough to make the earth obey. Around the base, the scan picked up a shallow ring of engravings, too faint for the raw data to resolve, but clear enough for the reconstruction engine to guess their strokes. The linguist leaned forward, breath held. Paleo-Hebrew. Primitive, angular, older than the temple, older than the common scripts of Judah. The characters surfaced one by one, then locked into a sentence that hummed through the speakers like a verdict. "Here the warden stands guard. Do not open." The word choice was strange. Not priest, not guardian, not even angel. Warden. A title of custody, not devotion. The room was no sanctuary. It was a cell, both prison and garrison, a place where the duty was not worship, but vigilance. The acoustic model began to populate in pale lines of sound. The physicist seeded the simulation with a low sine wave and watched as the ripple met the curvature of the wall, bent, ricocheted, and collapsed into itself. The chamber drank the tone, swallowed it whole, and gave almost nothing back. No standing waves, no persistent echo. Even at higher frequencies, the energy pooled toward the center, as if the air itself conspired with the stone to keep vibration from touching the rim. "Sound trap," the physicist said softly. "Not quite anechoic, something else. A vault built to keep resonance from spreading." The archaeologist watched the heat map drain to blue. "To keep something in," he said, "or to keep something out." The chemical overlay flickered. Residues along the inner ring, faint but real. Lead microparticulates dusted into a resinous binder, and in 3 points spaced like marks on a clock. Tiny blooms of mercury signature where the instrument should have read sterile stone. The same metals from the shrine above had found their way down here, as if ritual and physics had been braided into a single craft. No tool marks appeared in the model. No grooves. No chiseling scars. Just smooth, exact curvature, as if the wall had been turned on a lathe too large for the imagination. The engineer rejected the first readout and ran a different algorithm. The result did not change. The circle was not merely perfect to the eye, it was perfect to the math. They forced themselves back to logic. Jerusalem had quarries. Ancient masons had clever hands. Given enough time and enough polish, perhaps perfection was an accident repeated until it became design. But then the AI highlighted density gradients beneath the floor. A second skin, an outer shell more compact than the limestone, as though the bedrock had been case-hardened. "How do you harden a mountain?" the geologist asked, no one in particular. The answer did not come from science. It came from memory. Accounts from distant coasts where priests poured liquid metals into the cracks of stone, where altars were sealed with compounds meant to repel impurity and spirit alike. Byblos, Carthage, Ugarit, places where liturgy spoke the language of containment. The parallels were not proof, but they were a path, and the path led here. In the center of the chamber, the model detected a basin, circular, knee-high, carved of the same bedrock, its rim beveled until it almost vanished. Around it sat smaller objects, their profiles simple and severe, shallow lamps perhaps, or cups for oil. Spectral traces suggested substances that did not belong to ordinary sacrifice: lead salts, mercury vapor residues, and plant signatures matching sedatives and hallucinogens used in rites of trance and warding. Not offerings then. Instruments, tools meant to do work upon the unseen. The linguist read the inscription again, slowly, searching the strokes for ambiguity, but the grammar would not bend. The warden stands guard. The phrase was procedural. The command that followed, "Do not open," was not pious rhetoric. It was operational instruction. "Warden of what?" the historian asked. No one answered. The physicist pushed the simulation harder, mapping how a human voice would behave at a whisper, a chant, a shout. In each case, the sound fell toward the center and died there, a candle pinched by a glass. Then he reversed the model. What if vibration began at the center? The lines erupted into complexity, then folded swiftly back upon themselves, smothered by the curve before they could reach the wall. Energy might rage in the heart of the room, but the design refused to let it touch the edge. "A containment field," he murmured, half mocking the sci-fi of his own words, half believing them. "What if the warden isn't a person?" someone said. "What if the warden is the chamber?" It was a thought no one had wanted, waiting for the first brave tongue. The inscription could be read in stone, not in flesh. Here the warden, this geometry, this physics, this ritual of metals and air, stands guard. "Do not open" was less a superstition than a maintenance note. Do not break the system. Do not breach the curve. Do not let pressure equalize between what is inside and everything else. They fed the periodic pulse from the section above into the model. The 42-minute heartbeat, a low, nearly infrasound throb, entered the circular space and weakened, collapsing into nodes like rain into sand. The chamber did not echo it. It cancelled it. Outside the lab, dawn bruised the sky above the old city. Inside, the screens painted a different morning, one 3,000 years old and still awake. The longer they watched, the more the room's intent clarified. It was a lock that locked inwards. A silence built to oppose a sound. The historian paged through Apocrypha like a man searching for his own shadow. The Watchers in Enoch, the mighty ones of old in Genesis, the fallen bound in dark places in Isaiah. It wasn't that the texts proved the chamber. It was that the chamber felt like the room those words had been trying to remember. And with that recognition came the oldest fear on earth, the fear of curiosity crossing a line. The project head drafted the email none of them wanted to write. Cease scans. Seal dataset. Report to authorities. He hovered over the send key, a tremor in his finger. In the hallway, two of the team whispered about protocols, about what responsibility meant when your instrument peered into something that looked less like a ruin and more like a decision. The AI chimed. The reconstruction had found additional etching along the upper curve of the wall. Fainter, more damaged, but legible enough to translate with a margin of doubt. Let the warden stand until the light breaks the seal. Light. A simple word that pulled everything taut. If you lifted a lid. If you cut a door. If you kindled a lamp. If you let the first ray enter a space that had been kept in darkness by will and ritual and geometry, then the warden would no longer be standing. The system would no longer be a system. The cell would become a room again, and whatever function had endured, the containment, the cancellation, the silence, would fail. The historian closed his eyes. "It's procedural," he repeated. "It's all procedural." The email went out. Within the hour, the call came back, firm, official, and final. All work would be archived under restricted access. All publishing would be delayed indefinitely. The phrasing was familiar. Security, sensitivity, stability. Words that meant, do not open. The lab emptied, but the screens remained bright. The chamber turned slowly in the 3D render, its edges flawless, its message unblinking. The warden stood and would go on standing, as long as no one asked the mountain to do otherwise. Night returned to Jerusalem. On the plateau above, prayers rose and fell, and shoes brushed ancient stone. Beneath it, a circle of engineered quiet held its shape against time, metals asleep in the dark, waiting for the one thing it had been built to resist: light. It was never meant to be read. That certainty settled over the team the moment the AI stitched the last layers of the lower model and resolved with patient cruelty the shape within the core. A capsule, short, dense, unmistakably metallic, nested inside stone like a seed inside a fruit. The density profile left no doubt about the metal: lead. The casing was not a decorative cylinder. It was a coffin for words. And the words, if they were words at all, were there to do work, not to carry meaning across time. They increased the scan frequency one cautious notch at a time. The signal wandered through the stone, faltered at the lead, then slipped, just barely, between microfissures where age and pressure had opened channels too narrow for the human eye. The image that emerged was broken and granular, but it was enough to sketch the truth. Inside the lead lay a roll, thin, coiled tight, layered upon itself like a sleeping thing. The fiber analysis read like a litany: plant cell structures, mineral inclusions, traces of resin. Not ordinary papyrus alone, but papyrus dusted with powdered stone and sealed with a hardening binder. A composition designed to survive not readers, but centuries. Along the outer edge of the lead casing, marks appeared. Faint at first, then steady under the AI's reconstruction. They were not letters meant for sentences. They were circular, recursive, repeating as they circled the cylinder like planets around a sun. The linguist, who had spent her early career on Mesopotamian amulets, forgot to breathe. "These are apotropaic," she said, words to turn things away. Not declarations, not stories, bindings. The symbols did not map to Hebrew or Aramaic, though fragments kissed their alphabets. Older hands had taught these strokes. Proto-Canaanite curves bled into Akkadian sign logic, with insertions that looked like nothing catalogued. The private shorthand of a guild that wrote for forces, not for kings. The AI hesitated at translation, then gave up pretending the symbols were prose and searched pattern libraries for ritual syntax. The match, when it came, was neither perfect nor modern. But it was close enough to pronounce a phrase, and the phrase uncoiled like iron in the room: seal of the deep ones. No one said anything for a long while. The historian's lips moved, but only to shape questions he refused to hear. At last, the physicist found his voice. "Deep ones," he echoed, as if the term might change if he tasted it first. It did not change. It thickened, dragged memory to distant texts where depths were not geography but rank, places below places, layers of worlds stacked like strata of law. They pushed the scan to the edge of prudence. The lead fought back, greedy for every wavelength, jealous as only a metal built to protect can be. A few more characters surfaced along the outermost wrap of the inner roll, where age had thinned the barrier and the mountain's weight had pressed the spiral tight. The linguist parsed what the machine could not, restoring lines by inference and by the obstinate empathy of a mind long trained to love dead tongues. The result was a sentence cracked down the vertebrae but still capable of standing. "When the light breaks the seal, the warden's hand shall fall." It should have sounded like myth. Instead, it sounded like procedure, a system's failure mode described in human words. Light, the one thing the chamber had been built to forbid. A seal, not metaphorical, but a literal union of lead, resin, stone, geometry, instruction. The warden's hand, whether of flesh or of curve, falling, the system switching off. That was the logic the room had whispered since they first mapped it. That was the logic the inscription confirmed. The archaeologist, older now by a dozen sleepless nights, leaned his forehead against his knuckles. "This isn't scripture," he said. "It's engineering." And yet the language refused to stay in one world. The phrase, "deep ones," pulled nets of story from every shore of the Near East, Anunnaki cast below the earth, rebellious watchers shackled in Enoch's dark, the well of souls murmured beneath the rock. It was not proof, it was correspondence. The past had always braided theology, and technology in ways modern categories could not easily separate. An oath could be a switch, a prayer could be a lock. They tried to read further. The metal refused them. Anything stronger risked damaging the roll, and to harm it was to cross a line that none of them were willing to name out loud. The official orders had already arrived. Archive, seal, report. But compulsion had its own momentum, and the team reasoned with themselves the way all trespassers do. One more scan. Gentler lower power, just enough to see if the inner text ran left to right, or spiraled inward in an older fashion. The machine obliged with a hazy curl of ink density that told them nothing except that someone had written with a hand that knew the cost of a crooked stroke. Speculation multiplied like shadows. Perhaps the scroll listed rites to renew the containment. Times, seasons, oils and metals to be replenished. Words to be spoken precisely so the chamber kept cancelling the sound that should not reach the wall. Perhaps it was not a manual at all, but a threat. A legal notice to the powers that held dominion over the lower places. Or perhaps it was a compromise in writing, a covenant between priesthood and presence. Stay, and we will stand. Break, and we will not stand between you and the world. The linguist traced the circular sigils around the casing again, head tilted. "This is not meant to be understood," she said finally. "It's meant to be obeyed." Obedience proved contagious. Even those who had argued for deeper scans found themselves lowering their voices in the lab, turning away from the render when the lead cylinder rotated into view, as if refusing eye contact might qualify as respect. The phrase on the wall, "do not open," had been a warning before. Now, with the scroll's logic in the room, it felt like a boundary condition, the value without which the whole equation failed. Word of the scroll, S existence, seeped through the quiet channels that all institutions pretend they do not have. A rabbi with clearance called it a test. A priest called it a temptation. A scholar of Islamic jurisprudence invoked the doctrine of Sa'd al-Darai, blocking the means to harm, and argued that the greatest reverence one can show a holy site is to leave its secrets unopened. The secular authorities, less poetic, called it liability on a planetary scale. The team complied. Mostly. In the last hours before the servers imaged the drives and the data vanished into a vault with a name they were not told, the physicist ran one final model he did not save. He simulated a breach, a ray of light knifing into the circular chamber after 3,000 years of curated dark. The result was not an explosion, not a quake, not anything cinematic. It was quieter and more terrifying. The cancellation field dissolving in milliseconds, the nodes collapsing into echo. The basin at the center no longer the drain of sound, but its source a bloom of resonance rising like breath after drowning. He closed the window and deleted the cache. When they left the lab that night, the old city was awash in lamps. Above them, footsteps drifted across the stones of a plaza that has taught the world to pray. Below them, a cylinder of lead dreaming in a cradle of rock held words whose purpose was to hold a purpose, and all of it balanced upon a sentence. When the light breaks the seal, the warden's hand shall fall. It was never meant to be read. Perhaps it had already been read once, by those who built the room. Perhaps to read it again was to break the only promise that still held. So they did the most difficult thing scholars can do. They left the scroll unread. The first rumor did not say scroll. It said warning. It said someone had read the words no one was meant to read, that a command had crossed 3,000 years to land on a modern screen. In the old city's coffee houses and the hush of study halls, the narrative took the shortest path to human breath. Beneath the mount, lay a room, and in that room was a sentence, and the sentence said not to open what men have always opened. No files were published. No officials confirmed anything. But reverence thrives on absence. What could not be verified became what could not be denied. Within days, the whispers learned new old names: Nephilim, Watchers, Anunnaki. Each faith has its vocabulary for power that lives under the threshold of the world, and Jerusalem has learned them all. The mountain did not change, the stories did. And as they changed, people moved as if the stones themselves were listening. A young rabbi told his students that some doors are holy precisely because they are closed. A Greek priest spoke of the harrowing of hell and of the one who descended and returned, and he wondered aloud whether a place can be sanctified by what it keeps in as much as by what it welcomes. A scholar of Islamic tradition cited accounts that call the mount the place where realms meet, and he shook his head gently. If a seal exists, it is a mercy. If it breaks, it is a test. None of them had seen the scan. All of them understood the logic. For a moment, the city felt strangely aligned, its oldest arguments braided into a single thread, not of agreement, but of caution. Pilgrims lined the edges of the plaza, lips moving in private treaties with heaven. Vendors sold dates and postcards with a softer voice. Even the crows that haunt the walls seemed to circle wider, as if the air near the dome were newly occupied. The Well of Souls returned to conversation like a long-estranged relative. Guides pointed, not too directly, to the natural cave beneath the rock, where tradition says the dead wait for judgment, and where some believe the spirits can be heard if you press your ear to the stone. The story is older than the Golden Dome, and younger than the foundation below it. It is a myth that behaves like a machine. Tell it to a child, and they will not sleep. Tell it to a city, and the city walks more carefully. What unsettled the scholars most was not the resurrection of legends, but the way the chamber's engineering seemed to rhyme with them. The circle that cancelled sound like a priest cancels a curse. The basin that held metals used in ancient bindings. The inscription that read like a protocol. The sealed void whose only mortal enemy was light. Theology had always argued about metaphors. This did not act like metaphor. This acted like intent, and yet it could still be wrong. The team repeated that to themselves the way sailors repeat the names of stars. Spectral analysis can mislead. Resonance models can overfit. A phrase in Paleo-Hebrew can slip sideways into poetry when the grammar would prefer prose. The human mind is a lockpicker. Give it 2 tumblers and it will find a third. But Jerusalem is not a laboratory. It is a stage on which caution must sometimes perform as certainty to keep an audience from burning the theater down. The authorities chose their lines. No excavation permits, no public comment, no additional surveys. A silence like sand settled into the gears. Press offices wrote paragraphs that said nothing and said it beautifully. The vacuum filled itself. Amateur cartographers overlaid maps of known tunnels with rumored caverns until a pattern emerged that looked like fear wearing geometry as a mask. Mystics posted diagrams of sigils that matched the circular marks on the lead. Engineers argued over whether a 3-meter monolith could remain perfectly vertical for millennia if it were hollow, and men who had never believed in angels found themselves using the word Warden without irony. The argument never resolved because the city would not let it. Jerusalem is a multiplier. Small questions pass through it and come out large. What was inside the chamber? What would happen if the seal broke? Would the world notice, or would only Jerusalem feel the change, the way a heart feels a skipped beat that no machine can find? In a closed meeting, an ethicist from a secular university asked the question that had waited patiently behind all the others. Do people have a right to know? She did not mean the public. She meant the species. If there exists a constructed containment beneath the holiest mountain on earth, if an ancient system still hums against an unnamed pressure, does our duty to knowledge outweigh our duty to the living? The room was quiet. No vote was taken. Some truths, can only be carried alone. Elsewhere, a cab driver told a story he'd heard from his grandfather about a tremor long ago that rattled the city but did not crack the rock, and about old men who said they felt a pressure release like the mountain exhaled. Elsewhere, a woman from Haifa dreamed that a circle of light opened beneath the mount and that music poured out, not melody, but the rush of wind through 1,000 sealed flutes. She woke with the taste of iron in her mouth and would not take the tram that day. It would have been easy, comforting even, to dismiss all this as hysteria. People hunger for enchantment the way drought hungers for cloud. But the danger of a mystery is not that it is false. The danger is that it fits. Fit is a kind of truth. The chamber fit too well, with the well of souls, with Byblos and Ugarit, with Enoch's mountains and Isaiah's depth, with every culture's conviction that some powers belong under a threshold watched by someone who does not sleep. At a round table convened quietly in a neutral office, a rabbi, a priest, and an imam spoke in the grammar of engineers. Not doctrine, but risk. Not prophecy, but failure modes. Do not open is not an article of faith, they agreed. It is a design requirement. If you were to design a city to live over a wound, you would teach its people to walk softly. You would surround the wound with prayer, not because prayer is magic, but because prayer slows the hand. Still, a human hand exists that can always be raised. Curiosity is a lever. It only needs a fulcrum. The scroll would do. The warden would do. The idea that truth lies captive beneath the stone would do. Somewhere surely, there is a person who believes that revelation is worth any price, that the world deserves to know what the mountain has known too long. The team tried not to picture that person. They tried to imagine instead what the Chamber S builders had feared enough to invent such patient silence. The fear might not have been of demons or giants, not even of gods. It might have been of human beings, of us, meeting our own reflection in a room where echoes cannot form, of opening the stone and discovering that what we call the sacred is also the dangerous, that worship and warning were always the same sentence written in different ink. By now, the rumor had hardened into a practice. People paused as they crossed the plaza. Some touched the stone and drew their fingers back quickly, as if the mountain were a stove. Others looked up at the gold nighttime face of the dome and imagined a circle far below, perfectly cut, perfectly tuned, perfectly waiting. The city held its breath. Faith stood at the brink, not of unbelief, but of comprehension, the most radical form of belief there is. And on a server in a locked room, a model of a room no one would enter rotated in simulated darkness, untroubled by our need to choose between myth and mechanism. It offered another choice, older than both. Restraint. If restraint is a prayer, Jerusalem was praying. If silence is a policy, Jerusalem was governed. If fear is wisdom when the stakes are measured in cities, then Jerusalem was wise. And still, beneath it, the warden stood. Skepticism arrived like rain, quiet at first, then everywhere, beating on every surface of the story until nothing looked dry. In a better world, it would have come sooner. In this one, it came right on time, summoned by the one virtue that keeps civilization from burning itself on its own curiosity. The habit of asking whether what we want to be true has dressed itself as data. The first objection struck at the instrument. Ground-penetrating radar is not a camera. It is a negotiator that bargains with density and returns compromises. Stone lies. Moisture lies more beautifully. A well-placed clay seam can masquerade as a wall. An ancient void, partly infilled, can sketch the silhouette of a corridor that never bore a footstep. The AI's reconstructions, glorious in their clarity, were still reconstructions. Choices layered on probabilities, artistry braided with math. A skeptic held up two images, one raw, a snowstorm of noise, one finished, a cathedral in limestone. Somewhere between them, he warned, is the place where certainty got lonely and adopted imagination. Then came the geology. Jerusalem sits upon a complexity of limestone beds, dolomitic intrusions, and old faulting. Weather and water remember their roots even after the channels dry. Karstic processes can polish curves, create ovals, even mimic symmetry when pressure and dissolution play patient games. Perfect circles do not belong to nature, said the engineer. They don't belong to archaeology either, said the geologist. They belong to measurement error. The room laughed, but softly, as if the joke might be true. The chemistry did not escape the storm. Mercury signatures, lead particulates, resin ghosts. Are we reading ritual or contamination? Centuries of lamps, workshops, and repairs speckle the old city with metals. Pilgrims bring offerings in vessels that leak a trace and leave a theory. Even the idea of an even film on the standing stone could be an artifact of averaging across a rough surface. Spectral matches are seductions. Libraries whisper yes when the heart already wants it. A chemist redid the baselines and produced a less ecstatic graph. There is mercury, she allowed, but whether it anoints a theology or just paints a history of human hands, that I do not know. Language, too, asked to be believed more slowly. Paleo-Hebrew is a script with cousins and ancestors. A missing stroke can turn warden into watcher, watcher into servant, servant into pillar. The circular sigils looked like binding texts to those who had spent lifetimes with binding texts, and pattern recognition is a gift that buys its owner both bread and trouble. The linguist herself, lover of dead alphabets, wrote 2 translations on the whiteboard and circled the doubt between them. I still read "do not open," she said. But I would be dishonest if I did not say a scrupulous colleague could read "do not profane" and sleep at night. Even the heartbeat, the 42-minute pulse that had turned skepticism into superstition for a few sleepless hours, found people willing to unwind it. Infrasound does not need a monster, it needs a city. Subways throw their low thrum like nets. HVC systems hum in municipal rhythms no one hears until a scientist listens. The physicist checked the signature against timetables and maintenance schedules. The numbers did not fit, but they also did not prove what fear craved. The safest conclusion remained the one no one wanted to print. Unknown source consistent with infrasound of non-seismic origin. The sentence tasted like cardboard. It was the right meal for hungry minds. Then there was history, stubborn in its refusal to bend too far. Tellerad's sealed altars remained sealed, yes, but historians have learned not to build cathedrals of inference upon stones of resemblance. A dual altar is not a door, a monolith is not a prison, and a practice in one province does not export itself whole to another without losing pieces along the caravan road. The parallels with Byblos and Ugarit, fascinating in their harmonies, could be echoes rather than evidence. Convergence is not conspiracy. Sometimes cultures rhyme because humans keep the same fears in differently shaped jars. The most uncomfortable skeptic was ethics itself. Suppose the chamber exists as described. Suppose the scroll says exactly what the machine thinks it says. What then? Knowledge is not sterilized by good intentions. An announced discovery would bring cameras, crowds, and competing jurisdictional claims too numerous for any court to harmonize. The plaza would become a pressure cooker. A single excavation permit, issued or denied, could tilt the city from prayer to panic. Scholars who had never spoken above a whisper began to adopt the tones of fire marshals. Our first duty, said one, is to make sure the truth, if it is truth, does not kill anyone on its way into the world. So the handbrake engaged. Not denial, not suppression, delay. A cooling off. The data set locked. The copies inventoried. The lab audited by people who disliked stories in general, and this one in particular. The team submitted their methods for hostile review. Feed the raw returns to enemies and let them gnaw. Where the rivals found errors, they were published. Where they found none, they published harder questions. A conference panel assembled under a title that did not mention the mount, the chamber, the warden, or the scroll. Attendance exceeded the fire code anyway. Slowly, the exuberant model shrank to a conservative core. What remained after the wash was modest, maddening, and real enough to keep breath from fully settling. There are radar anomalies beneath the mount consistent with man-made voids. Some align in patterns suggestive of planning. A subset returns density readings compatible with sealed spaces. Traces to be explained include localized mercury and lead signatures deeper than expected, as well as a ring of marks that, if they are writing, resemble early Northwest Semitic. None of this, taken alone, proves a chamber with a job. All of it, taken together, refuses to be dismissed as mere wish. In the long evenings after the lab went quiet, the archaeologist walked the ramparts and practiced being grateful for restraint. He repeated the skeptic's catechism until it felt like prayer. Instruments err, maps seduce, symbols mislead, cities hum, history rhymes, people die. Then, when the wind off the hills made the dome shine like a lullaby, he allowed himself one heresy of hope, that the ancients had sometimes built with a wisdom we have not yet retranslated, that a room could be both physics and psalm, that a sentence carved in a circle could be faithful to both God and geometry. He returned to his desk and wrote what would be his only public line on the matter. A sentence so mild it seemed designed to disappoint. At present, the prudent path is to maintain non-invasive observation and resist interpretive escalation. Non-invasive, resist escalation, boring words, good words. The kind of words that keep old cities old. Not everyone agreed. Someone always wants the lever. But the lever needs a fulcrum, and the handbrake, blunt, unfamous, essential, kept the weight from shifting. No drills descended, no lights pierced stone. The model waited in its vault. Skepticism did not kill the mystery. It preserved it, like wax around a wick. The flame could still be lit one day, by better instruments, or by a consensus brave enough to trust them. Until then, the wick remained intact, and the room, if it existed, remained a room. If there was a warden, it stood. If there was a warning, it worked. And if there was a scroll, its unread words continued to do the one work they had always been meant to do. Hold. Jerusalem did not change, not visibly. The call to prayer still climbed the dawn air like smoke. Bells still threaded the hours. The gold of the dome still caught fire at sunset, and the same dust still settled on the same stones that have outlived every empire that touched them. But beneath that stillness ran a quieter current, an awareness that somewhere below all this noise, below the feet of pilgrims and guards and children chasing pigeons, there might be a room that was not meant to be remembered. The chamber, if it existed, was sealed again in silence, digital this time. The files encrypted, the drives stored, the people dispersed. The scientists went back to teaching and publishing ordinary things. A few left archaeology altogether. The physicist moved to a coastal city and wrote software for sonar mapping. The linguist returned to her faded manuscripts and swore off all research that began with a myth. But some nights, when sleep refused to come, she still saw those three words across the inside of her eyelids. Do not open. The phrase had changed its meaning. It was no longer an order. It was a mirror. Because what it reflected was the same thing every civilization must one day face. The line between knowing and keeping faith. Between opening the seal and guarding the mystery. Humanity has always lived at that line, pretending it is a wall, and every age has taken its turn scratching at the stone. In the months that followed, a strange peace took hold. The rumors cooled. The journalists moved on to newer cathedrals of outrage. But in the spaces where scholars and clerics meet without microphones, the conversation never stopped. Some said the chamber, true or not, had served its purpose. It had taught restraint, that rarest of sciences. It had reminded the world that mystery is not a flaw in knowledge, but a dimension of it. Others were less sure. They argued that faith without curiosity is decay, that what we call sacred is often just fear with good manners. They quoted Prometheus, they quoted Galileo, they quoted verses about seeking truth in all creation. To them, do not open was not a warning. It was a dare. Neither side won because both were right. The mountain remained what it has always been, a negotiation. Between heaven and earth. Between obedience and inquiry. Between the human need to look inside and the older wisdom that sometimes light should not touch certain darknesses. There are stories too, unverified, gentle as folklore, of moments that felt like reminders. A tremor that brushed the old city one morning and vanished before seismographs could measure it. A humming heard near the southern wall during a night prayer, dismissed as wind until the microphones failed to record it. A worker repairing a stone gutter swore that when he placed his ear to the slab, he heard the sea. Perhaps coincidence. Perhaps the earth breathing through its own legends. And yet in their quiet way, these stories performed the same work as the seal. They kept the city careful. Caution spread through Jerusalem like incense, invisible but everywhere. People stepped lighter. Conversations dropped to whispers when they brushed against the word beneath. The archaeologist visited the mount once more before retirement. He walked its perimeter at dusk, when the crowds thinned and the light burned copper across the domes. He thought of everything he had not done, the data he had deleted, the questions left unanswered. And he realized that the act of not opening had become its own discipline, as rigorous as any science he had ever practiced. He was not guarding a secret. He was preserving a silence that belonged to something older than explanation. He placed his hand against the ancient stone and felt nothing but its warmth. Maybe that was enough. Maybe the purpose of the Warden was not to hold something in, but to hold us back just long enough to remember humility. He smiled then, the tired private smile of a man who has learned that reverence is not fear, but proportion. Beneath him, if the models were right, lay circles within circles, lead and resin, mercury and limestone, silence built upon silence. A machine older than memory, still performing its function simply because no one had told it to stop. The sun fell. The plaza emptied. The city exhaled, and somewhere underfoot the Warden stood guard, not as a creature, not as a curse, but as the shape of our own restraint, carved in stone and shadow, keeping its long, patient watch. Do not open, not because the mountain hides hell, but because it reminds us what heaven costs when we forget to be careful. The archaeologist turned, leaving the mount to its evening prayers. In the glow of lamps behind him, the dome shone like an eye that had seen everything and chosen, for now, to close.